The war in Ukraine has changed the world, and now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project ReInforceUA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on ReInforceUA.com.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you here at Business School MIM with our ReInforce.UA project. And I would like to thank everyone who helped us to create the project, where we in Ukraine are joining ideas in order to stand strong and in order to develop. I would like to thank Bogdan Havrilishin Family Foundation, who is one of the leading partners in this project. I would like to thank our MBA Association of MBAs, EFMD, and AACSB as main partners in this project. And I would like to welcome the speaker of today, Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who is one of the leading organizational psychologists who specializes in leadership, who uses science and tech to help organizations predict human performance. Welcome, Tomas.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. It's our pleasure. And as we start, and as I've read a lot about you, I've probably watched all of the videos that are available. But one thing is really interesting. How would you define leadership, your area of specialty?
So when we think about leadership, we think really of a range of behaviors that enables a group of people to collaborate effectively. So when we think about leaders, that tends to be more of a role. It can be formal or informal, but leadership is what leaders or people who occupy leadership roles, positions of power, responsibilities do in order to enable a group of individuals to become a high-performing team. And you can use the same logic to understand units, organizations, and indeed societies and nations. We know from systematic research spanning back decades that the people who are in positions of leadership are responsible for about 30 to 40% of the outcomes that we can evaluate at the level of teams, units, or organizations. So leadership is a fundamental force that shapes the dynamic of individuals, of groups, and societies alike.
Fantastic. And leadership is so important, and it gives so much result. But why so many mediocre men rise to the top?
Well, on the first part, yes, it is important. We know that, and I know you had Professor Yuval Harari speaking in this forum as well. We know that the capacity to collaborate effectively is one of the critical markers that explains the evolution of Homo sapiens and of human civilizations. But we also know that this capacity isn't organic. It doesn't happen in an endogenous or natural, spontaneous way. It requires somebody to coordinate and guide human activity. So again, leaders are disproportionately impactful and consequential in our ability to collaborate effectively. And just like anything else, just like with any other skill or talent, whether that is the ability to play a musical instrument, speak a language, or perform a sport or a hobby or an art, with leadership, we have to think about a spectrum of ability and talent. And that spectrum ranges from people who are not very capable or very incapable to people who have an extraordinary ability to influence and coordinate collective human activity in an effective way. Now, what we know is that both in politics and in organizations, whether that's for-profit corporations or non-profit organizations, there is a gap between the people who are most capable of effectively helping others to collaborate. There is a gap between individuals who actually have leadership talent or leadership potential and individuals who actually get to occupy these positions. So in the organizational psychology literature, we talk about the gap between leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness. So on the one hand, you have to emerge as a leader in order to be effective. If you don't occupy a position of power and responsibility, you will not be able to display or exercise leadership behaviors and help people collaborate effectively. On the other hand, we know that in any organizational or group or collective setting, a great frequency of individuals who are in leadership roles actually have very little talent or potential for leadership. And in order to explain this on a high level, the basic explanation is that we're not really good at choosing leaders on the basis of their competence, on the basis of their talent or potential. More often than not, we focus on style rather than substance. And that's true whether we're looking at HR managers or hiring managers selecting leaders, or indeed voters in democratic elections electing leaders. It's like we focus on things that are not just unrelated, but often negatively correlated with actual leadership performance.
So we as human beings, as organizations, seem to be vaguely effective in selecting relevant people to occupy leadership positions. But one thing throughout generations was very simple as indication of a leader. It has to be him. Why? Why the human race had selected men as leaders? And MIM Kiev as a business school has a woman as a leader, and we are totally happy with that, and we think that that's one of the best leaders you ever can have. But there are not so many as us. Why?
So there are two important and I think quite interesting historical issues at stake here. The first is we really need to step back and take a long-term historical perspective and really look at what has happened throughout our 300,000 years of evolution or so. And throughout this time, these 300,000 years or so, for the vast majority of this time, life was pretty simple. And actually making inferences about people's leadership potential and talent was way more simple than today. First of all, we would live most of our lives and die just having met or interacted mostly with 15 or 20 people. So, we lived most of our time in our human evolution with 15 or 20 individuals. Everybody knew each other very well. Everybody had a very accurate reputation. There was very, very little room for deception and for manipulating impressions. And by the way, another important point, the elements or components or ingredients of talent were very straightforward and very observable. So, you would look at somebody, and if they had physical strength or courage, or they were fast or tall, you knew that they were a good candidate for a leadership role. And if you made mistakes, these were very costly. If a group of hunter-gatherers elected or selected the wrong person, they would be eaten or killed by rivals. So they would disappear from the gene pool. Now, the second point I want to make is that throughout most of our early history as hunter-gatherers, which, by the way, represent a much longer period of time than modern human society, leadership was very egalitarian. Even from a gender perspective, we would elect or select individuals to lead these groups who were female, who were mostly characterized for being knowledgeable, experienced, and for actually making better decisions that other people could. So if you fast forward through thousands of years and you get to humans living in big cities, we had to, for the first time, learn to infer leadership and talent in strangers. We had to, for the first time, learn to trust others. You and I are having a conversation now. We never met before, but we have elements or informational let's say, nudges, if you like, that enable us to trust each other, which basically also enables large-scale collaboration between strangers and societies. But when this happens, this also opens the door to free riders, to people who are good at deception, to people who are good at faking leadership talent. And what we know from our research and other people's research is that one of the best ways to actually fool other people into thinking that you are talented, either at leadership or anything else, is to fool yourself first. And, you know, this really is the chief explanation for the disproportionate overrepresentation, not just of men in leadership roles, but of incompetent men in leadership roles, because there are many, many competent men who don't get to occupy positions of leadership because they don't seem unaware of their limitations, ironically, because they are not unjustifiably pleased with themselves, and because they don't seem very aggressive or very assertive and very ambitious. So we inherited these brains, these ape-like brains that still want to make decisions based on gut feel, based on intuition. We want to look at somebody and work out in a few seconds or minutes whether they have the potential to lead not just a group or organization, but also a nation. And when we make mistakes, we don't want to accept that we made mistakes because our own ego is at stake. And, you know, whether you're a hiring manager who makes a mistake with selecting an employee, or a voter who makes a mistake selecting or electing a prime minister or a president, we have a tendency to interpret reality in a self-serving way. So if I voted for somebody who is running my country, you know, downhill or having a very bad effect on my society, or if I'm a manager who mistakenly decided to employ an employee who isn't performing, reality is sufficiently ambivalent or ambiguous that I can distort it or make a self-serving interpretation of that. And so this is the trap. This is the kind of vicious circle or cycle that we see, which explains the continuous prevalence of incompetent people in charge. And more often than not, they tend to be men, not just because men are more likely to be overconfident than women, but because when women display overconfidence, we actually don't react as favorably or as positively as when they are men. This is why when we point the finger at women for not leaning in or showcasing assertiveness or being more ambitious, it's a double bind. It doesn't really work for them, because when women outmale males in assertiveness or ambition, we find them uncomfortably ambitious or pathologically ambitious. So what we should do is, instead of pointing the finger at women for not behaving like overconfident males, is to stop falling for overconfident males when they don't have the talents or the leadership potential to back it up.
You know, probably during the last, when was it, 30, 40 years, we had this idea of competence or competencies as a measurement of future effectiveness. And instead of measuring leaders over aggressiveness or assertiveness, we started looking for something else which you cannot measure at the spot. And we had to develop something, some tools that could measure and could predict the future effectiveness in a leader. What would be your way of understanding, is a person sitting in front of you be a good leader within a month of him or her taking a position?
Yeah, great question. So I think the most important and most difficult thing to do is to first decontaminate or debias our measures of actual performance, whether that's in a month, 2, 6, or a year. Because if you're not evaluating people, including managers and leaders, for their contribution to an organization, for their contribution to a group, a team, a unit, an institution, or society, then it's going to be very difficult to deploy better methods to predict that performance, right? So if I'm in charge of if I'm hiring you and I'm in charge of evaluating your performance a month later or 6 months later, and my opinion is what makes up or constitutes reality, then any method of selection and of assessment will be optimized to predict my opinion. And as it turns out, my opinion might be made of a lot of factors or variables that are actually unrelated to your performance. I might like you because we support the same football team. I might like you because we grew up in the same city, or we went to the same school, or because we have the same accent, or because we're friends or relatives. So if you look at, there has been a lot of change in the last 100 years in terms of organizations' interest in reducing or eliminating nepotism and relying less on social capital, who you know, and more on psychological capital, who you are or what you know. Now, if we can do that, then we know that the attributes that we should be selecting for are things like intelligence, which determines the speed with which you can learn and your ability to be data-driven and make rational decisions. Your curiosity, which shapes your willingness to learn and to understand what you don't know. Your humility, which determines your ability to accept and your tendency to accept what you don't know and to be self-critical and vulnerable enough that you don't, think of yourself as a, as a all-knowing kind of godlike creature. And finally, your integrity, which determines your ability to resist temptations and to care more for others and display empathy and rational compassion. So if you think about these 4 traits, and I don't want to give you a longer list because these 4 would be more than sufficient to improve the quality of our leaders, both in organizations and nations, we know that methods such as psychological assessments, psychometric assessments, or a rigorous kind of data analytic kind of examination of your past records, and also asking your previous colleagues and your previous or current employees or direct reports how they see you, are way better predictors of your future job performance and are way better indicators of these traits than what you do in an interview. Because an interview invites people to manage impressions, it invites a great deal of deception. And not only are interviews bad in the sense of providing information about a lot of things that today we should ignore, whether you're female or male, attractive or unattractive, rich or poor, young or old, etc. But also, they're a very imperfect way to detect things like curiosity, intelligence, and integrity. A lot of the times when we think that somebody has social skills and that they have a great EQ or emotional intelligence and that they come across as charismatic, they're just narcissistic or even psychopathic. The only people who don't stress out in job interviews or in situations of great pressure are narcissistic psychopaths, or people who are so full of themselves that they don't experience any anxiety for being evaluated. So in essence, we should reduce the impact of style and focus more on substance. Again, not just when we pick future managers or leaders in an organization, but also when we pick politicians. It's unfortunate that anywhere in the world today, people want to decide who their political leaders are based on a televised a presidential debate or prime ministerial debate, no matter how many fact-checking algorithms or tools you have. We make up our mind within 30 or 40 seconds, which sometimes can end up in happy choices, but more often than not, it results in unfavorable choices, and it allows a lot of people who aren't really qualified to occupy positions of responsibility.
You just ruined everything that is taught about leadership, assertiveness or aggressiveness. Goodbye. All the job interviews where normal leaders are best at selling themselves, they're out. So all these things are not existing anymore. So, but it seems to me that some time ago, asking for an age in your job profile was forbidden. So would it be better if we forbid gender as well? So you select a leader without paying attention. Is it he or her?
Absolutely, and this is a really important point because even though when we look at, large-scale studies evaluating the qualities that actually make people better leaders, women on average in general have a slight advantage vis-a-vis men. It's not necessarily a wise or rational decision to appoint people on the basis of their gender, because that's like saying, if you know that height is advantage for something and that men are taller than women, I'm only going to select men. Well, you're going to end up with a lot of short men, because we all know women that are much taller than other men. And by the same token, when you're selecting individuals for leadership roles, the best policy and the best approach, not just in terms of boosting the quality of leaders, but also in terms of improving gender diversity, is to focus on talent rather than gender. So if we made leader selection more similar to a blind, wine tasting exercise, where you don't look at the brand and you don't look at the shape of the bottle and you don't look at the price, but you simply look at the quality of what's inside the bottle, we will not just end up with much better leaders, but we'd also end up with more women in leadership, and probably slightly more women than men in leadership roles. And by the way, it might be that in 100 years' time or in 200 years, if we over-index in things such as emotional intelligence, integrity, empathy, coachability, and self-awareness, we actually require people to be more assertive, more ambitious, and more bold and more overconfident. So this might change. But right now, the situation we're in is that we over-index. We spend too long hiring people on the basis of their assertiveness, their ambition, their bravado. So we ended up with a surplus of overconfident and narcissistic people in leadership roles. Charisma is slightly different, because I see it more as a neutral trait. It's an amplifier of your competence or your incompetence. If you're competent, I want you to be as charismatic as you possibly can, so that you can influence others better and you can be more impactful. But if you're incompetent, my best hope is that you have zero charisma, so that you cannot influence people. In history, and there's no need to give examples, we know both in politics and in the corporate world that when leaders are not competent or not ethical, charisma is a very, very toxic factor that actually makes them much more destructive. Whereas if leaders, are very uncharismatic, then and they're boring, that can mitigate their incompetence, and actually it can also mitigate their competence, which is an unfortunate scenario.
So it's an interesting point here. All the charisma is very emotional, but at the same time, we shouldn't pay as much attention to all those human factors and pay more attention to the competence factors. So maybe eliminate a human factor at all. Let AI select our future leader. What do you think of that?
So when we think about AI, we have to be careful, of course. We also, I think it is helpful to demystify it a bit. In HR, in human capital, in the world of businesses and management, AI is mostly machine learning algorithms. Algorithms are mostly recipes. Recipes are formulae that link different data in a data set. So really the only novel thing about AI is that these algorithms have the ability to correct themselves and get better at identifying patterns. So if we think about AI in this way on a high level, I see it as a great opportunity to be more evidence-based, to be more data-driven, because if there is a connection even between what somebody does in an interview and how they perform in the future, there is no question that computers and algorithms are going to be able to detect and act on the basis of that connection in a more reliable and trustworthy way than humans. But of course, it's important that we design ethical AI, that we deploy AI in an ethical way, that there is a benefit for employees and organizations, that we increase rather than decrease diversity and inclusion, and that we can explain why somebody is selected or why somebody is rejected. Quite often we hear criticisms of AI and algorithms for being black box models. And I think these are correct criticisms, and we need to ensure that we always know why an algorithm decided to select or reject somebody. But we shouldn't forget that the only entity or machine that is truly always a black box is the human brain, the human mind. You know, I can be a hiring manager and I can select somebody and persuade myself that that's because they're very competent, they're very qualified, they will be a perfect fit for the job. And perhaps it was, you know, the fact that I had too much coffee in the morning, or that they are attractive, or that they laughed at my jokes that made me select that person. And we can never really tell with humans. So I think AI is a good opportunity to improve our data centricity, to make hiring of employees and leaders more evidence-based. And it is also a great tool for exposing biases, because if you know that if algorithms reveal that people are getting promoted not on the basis of their performance, but on the basis of their gender, age, or ethnicity, then that's a really good opportunity to correct that and act on that. So you can use AI to measure diversity, but in order to drive inclusiveness or inclusion, that's a leadership issue. It's not something that algorithms can fix by themselves.
So about those leadership, coming back to the leadership issues, one of the things that I really like about the competencies model is when we talk about all the abstract terms like vulnerability and integrity, we cannot really guess them as soon as we can find a specific behavior that you can see and tell this is what an integrity means. This is, empathy. This is, so what would be your 3 to 5 best behaviors that you would say these are the great leader behaviors?
I like that approach a lot. And I think, it's essential that we break down these terms into behaviors to begin with, right? So even if we take something like empathy, which is the ability to understand what other people are thinking and feeling, and also the ability to care about them. I can imagine, a not so far-fetched world where even if people are working virtually or remotely, you can, first of all, scrape their communications, through natural language processing. You can detect whether they're using emotional words to reassure others, whether they're using positive words. So, the way we use language says a lot about our empathy and our emotional intelligence. You could also quantify the degree to which leaders listen to others versus speak. So, if we were in a situation where I'm your boss and you're my employee, and I really spent 90% of the time speaking and mansplaining things, and you can't say anything, I will be a very bad boss, and probably I don't care about you. I just want you as an audience. So you would actually monitor what percentage of their time leaders or bosses are listening versus speaking. And I think the final thing would be to measure whether managers and leaders are providing people with feedback. So when you do something, am I giving you feedback? What type of feedback am I giving you? Am I giving you feedback that is actionable, that is linked to your behaviors, that explains to you that if you change your behaviors, you might improve your performance? And am I constructively enabling you to change the way you approach work in a way that makes you better, and that, is not dissimilar to how, I don't know, a piano teacher, a music teacher, or a tennis teacher would tell you, improve your drive, hit it that way, where you actually see your boss or your manager as a coach, as somebody who can extract the best out of you and who can help you harness your potential. It's very, very different from a manager who is just focused on their own career advancement, who sees employees as a resource for their own career promotion, who wants to surround themselves with yes men or yes people, and who is so focused on their own image or their own reputation that they completely disregard others, and who sees their employees even as competitors and as a threat. We always hear people say, hire people smarter than you, but Narcissistic people hire people who look like themselves or people who are worse than themselves so that they can be, a godlike figure in their teams and organizations.
Excellent. And one of the questions that are coming up in our Q&A section is that probably there is another behavior where you can measure a great leader is a person where the leader is developing other leaders in his or her organizations. What do you think of that?
Absolutely. My colleague at London Business School, Herminia Ibarra, wrote a very famous article in Harvard Business Review called Leader as Coach. And she made this point, that the landscape of leadership has evolved from a position where leaders are the people who know a lot or have a lot of technical expertise to a point in which leaders are tasked with making others better and developing it. So I do think that, much like great football coaches have the ability to get young players and turn them into the future stars, great managers and leaders almost create a school of leadership whereby working with them actually helps you develop and harness their potential. And I know that anecdotally, or personally, we all know examples. Once we get to a certain age, we can see people in any field, whether it's HR, finance, business, where they all came from very, very specific mentors who have the ability not just to drive high performance in their teams, but also to create future leaders. And that is, I think it's a very underrated leadership skill, but it's a fundamental attribute of great leaders.
I believe that the recent movie a couple of years ago where Robert De Niro was starring, and that was called The Trainee, where him being a leader in the past is actually coaching a young female leader at his past factory. And that to me was a fantastic example. But I would like to draw, to bring our discussion into another area of leadership, because in a business sphere, yeah, I totally agree with you. But do you think should anything change, or will anything change if the turbulent times come, like we are at war now? And is the war leadership different from a peaceful leadership to your mind?
Yeah, this is a it's a question that has been asked for some time now, and I think there are two different but compatible answers to that question. And the first, really focus on the situational changes or the contextual or environmental challenges that are different, if you take from peaceful times to war times. And of course, we know what these are. In violent or war times, it's more important than ever that you have competent leaders that can be trusted, that can operate as a stabilizing force for their teams, organizations, or indeed societies, and who have the ability to kind of absorb some of the pressure and really make decisions that optimize, if you like, for people's well-being. So it's almost an ask or a challenge to basically focus on well-being, on morale, and I think it's a really important reminder that in today's world, more often than not, most of the problems that people in countries have are first world problems, because worrying about a slightly higher or lower rate of inflation or unemployment or the state of basic modern policies is really very trivial compared to the situation that you're in, or any war-like situation. At the same time, I think we need to remember the other perspective, which is the perspective that I have always emphasized, that whether in a war situation or in a situation of extreme crisis, as the vast majority of countries in the world have seen during the past 2 years with this global pandemic, the lesson is clear, is that when the stakes are high and people face real life-threatening problems, we just cannot afford to have leaders that lack integrity, that lack moral, values, that lack competence, that lack humility, and who lack empathy. But if you think about it, it is not true that in peaceful times or when things are going well, it's beneficial to have leaders who lack any of these traits. So I think I see war or any crisis or any situation of extreme challenge and extreme stress and pressure as something that simply amplifies the importance of good leadership. And when times are good, it is just easier for incompetent and inept leaders to get away with it because they're not in the spotlight. But when you're in a situation as you're facing now, there's just no room for mistake. And you just cannot rely on leaders who are weak, who are unqualified, or who aren't prepared for the challenge. And needless to say, any crisis, including war, puts leaders on the spotlight and emphasizes both the good and the bad qualities that they might have. So I think any crisis, and war is no exception, if you like, is an opportunity to remind ourselves of the critical importance of choosing correctly, of choosing the right leaders.
For us, being in this situation is really difficult to be unbiased. But one of the questions here is to you to assess, if you can, Russian President Putin as a leader, academically, I believe, not ethically or whatever the way you choose. How would you characterize him? That's what one of our professors is asking, please.
Yeah. So obviously I don't have assessment results, but I will nonetheless try to focus on the things that I think are quite obvious about his public reputation. And let me begin by saying that I don't see his profile as systematically different from a lot of strong men, macho-like leaders that we see in other countries. I have written about this 6-7 years ago. I think from a psychological perspective, Trump and Putin, for example, don't look so different. I think if you add, people like Boris Johnson, Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, even Cristina Fernandez, who was the president in my country for some time and is still kind of running the show from behind the scenes, they're very similar people. They're very focused on power. They exude assertiveness. They govern and persuade through strengths. I think they are romanticized by their followers as people who are very tough, very strong, and certainly overconfident. And I think they are in many ways typical examples of the profile that I describe in my book. They are characterized more by narcissistic overconfidence than by humble self-awareness. And I think that contributes both to their allure, to their appeal, because a lot of people want to be governed or led by people who seem very strong. It's a way to kind of deal with our own inherent weaknesses. And I think if you add to that the ability to politicize or tribalize people and to scapegoat individuals and to blame all of your problems or nation problems on certain external causes and to antagonize your rivals and create strong oppositions and to leverage that to accumulate power, you can explain the profile of Putin or the Putin phenomenon in a relatively obvious and superficial way without having to go to the specific history of Russia or Ukraine, which I know would enhance this, right? But I think from a psychological perspective, that's what I would say. And look, with all that said, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone with this personality or psychological profile will act in the same way. I think it's more complicated than that. There are also geopolitical and contextual forces that explain why something as horrible as a war can happen. And I think, if anything, it's somewhat of a consolation obviously not for people in the Ukraine now, but for the world in general. If we look at data for the past 200 or 300 years, the world is still becoming a more peaceful place. Things like the current war or other wars and conflicts that are happening in other places of the world are becoming more an anomaly, are becoming more an exception rather than the norm. If we go back again 1,000 years or 2,000 years, we would find that peaceful times were really the exception. They were happening very rarely and in very, very concentrated and selected periods. And if you're interested in this, Steven Pinker in his book Enlightenment Now has all the data that shows that, contrary to what we might think, peace tends to increase with the year, especially if we take a 1,000 or 2,000 year perspective.
Absolutely agree with Dr. Pinker here. He's developing this idea over several years of his research. And in one of your talks, you were talking about the skills that help the leader get up. The same set of skills helps them go quickly down. Is there any chance for a leader to stop this backfire?
Great question. So I think, of course, generally speaking, even when you are a senior leader and a powerful leader, there are people above you who are responsible for not just your selection, but for maintaining you or keeping you in a position of power. That might be boards in the case of corporations, voters, or institutions, or powerful entities in the case of politicians. So we should absolutely monitor leaders' performance, not just in order to try to coach and develop them, but also to hold them accountable and remove them when they're not delivering or when they're having harmful and toxic effects on others. Now, your question is interesting because the way I interpret it speaks to whether this can be self-driven, whether somebody in a position of power, leadership, or responsibility can self-correct and, after they underperform or they start behaving in problematic or toxic ways, they can kind of almost pivot or reframe. And that can happen. Again, we have to think about competence as a spectrum and incompetence as a spectrum. And I think there's a high proportion of managers and leaders, including political leaders, that hover around, the average or the center of the normal distribution, and who might deteriorate their performance or who might improve a little bit. So I think even if you have some egocentric, narcissistic, and antisocial tendencies, if you're driven by performance, if you're driven by results, and you are sufficiently in touch with reality to understand that things aren't going very well, you can absolutely try to change. Just like when you're not performing well on any job, on a presentation, and a speech, and you get the feedback, you can try different things and you can improve. And of course, practice, training, surrounding yourself with people who help you get better, they're all resources that are available to any manager and any leader.
So basically, you just answered a question that I wanted to ask you from our chat. Can you learn leadership, or is it a natural talent? And it seems that you just answered it, but let me ask it. Can you develop your leadership skill?
Yeah, so I think leadership is a learned behavior. Absolutely. Nobody is born a leader, nobody, even the most I would say fanatical advocate and champion of genetics would put a 1-year-old in charge of a corporation or a nation. Of course, sometimes there are nations that are led by people who don't seem that much more mature than a 1-year or a 5-year, but that's a different kind of issue. So leadership is learned, and I think the best leaders are always a work in progress. They're not a finished product. They keep on getting better, and they keep on learning from experience, and they keep on translating their experiences into growth and into a development of the potential. At the same time, we shouldn't ignore or neglect the evidence from hundreds of studies that show that even though leadership is developed in adult life and depends a lot on skill acquisition and educational training expertise, going to a good business school and having exposure to good professors is part of the issue. Nonetheless, we can predict how much potential people or how much leadership talent or competence people will develop from a relatively early age. You can't predict it perfectly, but when you show that people, even in their teens or in their childhood, exhibit things like compassion, like empathy, like curiosity, like intelligence, and a willingness to put themselves forward and to lead in courageous ways, even when they're young, these traits predict future leadership behaviors. So in that sense, Freud was correct when he said that the child is the father of men, because a lot of these things don't happen out of the blue. They develop, and the best predictor of future leadership performance is how much potential you had to begin with. So I think, if anything, we should take potential more seriously, not just in order to predict and appoint leaders, but also in order to decide who should be trained and developed as a leader. Because if you're more coachable, if you're more willing, to sacrifice your own selfish goals in the interest of others, then we should invest in you and we should teach you to be a leader, because the chances are you're going to learn it faster and better than others.
Thank you. One of the questions that we are asked is that we used to call rich people business leaders, but you're talking about the competencies of leaders. And can you actually put an equality sign between a rich person and a leader?
No, I don't think so. I think, in all fairness, there will be a correlation. And I think that correlation can be explained in two ways. One is that, if you ascend, let's say, a corporate hierarchy, and you do well in a corporate or professional career, the chances are that you can only go so far as an individual contributor or an employee. As you get better and as you perform, or as you're deemed more valuable, you're going to have more and more people to manage, right? So I think even if you're not a great manager, your internal promotion within the ranks of an organization or a corporation will align with the number of people that report to you. And then if we think about on the other side, for example, self-made entrepreneurs, of course, there are a small proportion of people who actually venture into entrepreneurial careers, but successful and effective self-made entrepreneurs have to be great leaders, because having the idea and having the business plan and selling it to others, that's all very nice and well and important, but it's probably 5 or 10% of the overall success. 90% is putting together a team, motivating it, and managing other people so that they can be part of something impactful in the future, right? So I don't know, to use an example, whether it's Amazon or Apple, it's the leadership skills and competence of Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos that have enabled these companies to be so impactful and so successful. It's not the original idea of creating a computer or an online bookstore. And I think that also reminds us that it's about the consolidation of a vision, of a view, and of a leadership philosophy or framework into the culture of an organization or a society that enables leadership to continue to be impactful over the years, and sometimes over the decades or over the centuries. I think when we look at nations and societies that are more successful and more effective, that's because through the years or through the centuries or decades, they have been positively influenced by institutions that have captured the effective values of their leaders.
If we look in the past, for the last 50 years, the image of a leader had changed drastically, like if you take 60s or 70s of the 20th century and today. But what do you think, what are the characteristics and how maybe how a leader would look like in 50 years?
Well, I think if we think about the impact that artificial intelligence and data and technology already had and will continue to have over the next, if not 50, 20 or 30 years, what I would predict is that leadership will have to become not just more human, but also more humane. In a world in which not just everyday business problems, but also long-term strategic decisions are increasingly made by machines who absorb a lot of data and can turn that data into insights and translate those insights into executionable strategies. I think the main role of leaders will be to care about others, to provide feedback to others, to make others better. And even on a very simple level, at the level of managers, is to ensure that this increasing dependence on technology and AI isn't dehumanizing work and organizations. Because fundamentally, any technology, including AI, should serve a human purpose. And I think we should accept that there's going to be a lot of tasks and a lot of problems that are better performed by machines than by humans. But we should also accept that it's a safe and sensitive prediction to make, that no matter how much machines and AI continues to evolve, they won't ever care about humans. They won't have empathy. They won't give a damn. And, so that's fundamentally what will continue to make leadership not just human, but also humane. For a long time, humans measured their uniqueness or the uniqueness of their species, of our species, and what makes us special by comparing ourselves to other animals, to non-human species. I think today, and even more so in the future, we will revisit what it means to be human in terms of understanding what it is that we can do, but machines and AI cannot do. And again, I think that is to feel for others, to care for others, and to actually make each other better when it matters and when machines are there to solve problems, but not to care about humanity.
And you observe leaders throughout the world. Do you think, is there any correlation between the culture the leader is from and the leadership style the person is developing?
Absolutely. And I think, the correlation allows for similarities between cultures. Just because you're from Ukraine and I'm from Argentina doesn't make us immediately different. In fact, there will be cultural similarities, but you will find many Ukrainians that are perhaps a better fit to traditional Argentine culture and some Argentines that are good fit for Ukrainian culture. So I think we should understand the personality of leaders at an individual level, not at a group level, but at the same time, we all learn to behave and learn to optimize our behaviors based on the experiences that we have. And those experiences can be framed and understood vis-a-vis an existing culture. So it is to be expected that if you are working for a Japanese manager, they would expect you to be more hierarchical and to obey and to listen to anybody in a situation of authority and to pay your respects, compared to somebody in Ukraine or in Australia or in Argentina. And it is also expected, if you are from Ukraine, Argentina, or Brazil, that in your interpersonal interactions, you should rely in a little bit of being a bit streetwise and informal and unstructured compared to somebody in perhaps, Sweden, Germany, and South Korea. So I think if culture is how we do things around here, that is a generic kind of measure of the behaviors that over time have informally and formally been rewarded and been sanctioned. And, only people who haven't traveled anywhere would deny this. I think the reason why it's always so enriching to travel to places is because whether you go to the same, cafe, you can go to a Starbucks in New York or a Starbucks in Rio de Janeiro or in Seoul or in Helsinki. And if you sit there and have the same coffee, the same drink, and you look around, you will see profound differences in how people behave. And the only people who deny this are people who are not interested in human diversity or who are too self-obsessed to pay attention to others.
So it seems to me that it's not only the organization who chooses a leader to itself, but also probably it's a good idea that a leader is selecting an organization he or she would lead by organizational culture. What do you think of that idea?
Absolutely. And, you know, in that sense, leaving aside maybe 40 or 50% of your leadership potential, which is foundational and will always depend on, you know, your intelligence, your curiosity, your humility, and your integrity. These traits are important in Kiev, in Buenos Aires, in Beijing, and in anywhere in the world, right? In Nairobi as well. But how you lead, how you persuade others to collaborate effectively, how you perform will also equally or perhaps even more largely be dependent by the fit between your style and the environment you're in. And that involves also the culture. And yet at the same time, we should also understand that nobody is truly a leader to keep everything as it is. You are only a leader if you have the ability to drive change. I think leaders are always a nexus between a present that isn't ideal and a future that needs to be created. So I always steal this phrase from Giampiero Petriglieri, who is a professor at INSEAD, who says, leadership is always an argument with tradition. It's an argument with the past, because I think leaders are the conduit or the vessel towards a better future. So if you fit in perfectly well with a culture or system or organization, you are probably not going to change anything. You're going to be institutionalized from the very beginning. So there is a case to be made for moderate misfits, for people who are able to fit in well enough that they are legitimized and validated and approved by others, but who also want to disrupt the status quo because they dream of replacing it with something better. So if you're adapting perfectly to your role, then you're probably not truly a leader.
So it seems that the university leaders, the academic leaders, they have to be rebels. We have to be rebels, because if we comply fully, then it means that we cannot teach the change.
Well, you know, speaking as an academic or recovering academic myself, I think there is definitely a rebel spirit that is alive and well in academia, which is evidenced both when people who could go to the private sector and who could have office jobs and who could have leadership jobs in corporations or indeed in politics choose not to do it because they're too anarchic or too rebellious to actually go and do it, and they value the independence and the free thinking spirit that academic institutions still largely provide. And in other instances, I think, we find that many academics are dispositionally unemployable. They just couldn't work for somebody. But at the same time, if you're forming the leaders of tomorrow and you try to develop people, it's not enough to teach them theory. You have to have some practical real life experience yourself, whether that's successes or failure, to convey your knowledge and bring that knowledge into a tangible, practical reality.
My final question as our time comes, and I remember the time is quite strict here. What communities to develop leadership skills would you recommend to our participants of today?
Listen, I think good universities are still an obvious choice, but I think what we have seen throughout our history is that most people learn by doing, getting experiences on the job, managing people, going outside your comfort zone and experiencing leadership firsthand is perhaps even more important than studying it from books, etc. And of course, one of the advantages of the digital age is that there is so much knowledge that has been democratized out there. I think that if people have curiosity and time, and you can always make time, you can learn a lot through other people's experiences. Choose the medium that you like, but you can never study too much. I think getting any exposure will only make you better and will help you understand what your values are, what your conviction is, and how you should lead, because you have to find a style that aligns with your values and with your personality as well.
Thank you so much. It is my absolute pleasure to have a conversation today with you. Dear participants, I would like to say thank you very much on behalf of MIM Kiev Business School to our Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who is one of the best organizational psychologists in the world, who is talking and learning and teaching about leadership, and who is saying that, yes, leadership can be learned. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Goodbye. Dear participants, I would like to thank you all for participating in ReInforce project of MIM Kiev Business School today. And I would like to express my absolute gratitude again to Bogdan Havrilyshin Family Foundation and to be our main partner in this project. And I would like to thank the Association of MBAs, AMBA, the EFMD, and AACSB associations that are supporting us in bringing the best world knowledge to the Ukrainian and international participants of today. Thank you for standing with Ukraine today.